Perfect. And the way that we will run this today is Jean will start us off with her presentation for roughly 20 or so minutes, followed by a presentation by Alex, and then we will have time at the end for any questions, comments, or thoughts to discuss. So without further ado, I'm very excited to be passing on to Jean.
Well, thanks very much, Joshua, and thank you very much for your kind invitation today. I really appreciate it. And hello to everyone. Hopefully we'll speak later as we get into the question and answer period. Can you see this presentation okay? Perfect. Okay. So Joshua didn't give us a small task. The title of the role of, I put in geological engineers and landslide management, is obviously a substantial career-defining topic, but I'll do my best to cover some elements of it in 22 so minutes. And as Joshua said, I'm very pleased to just have retired from the department that you see below at Queen's University. So one of the most significant defining disasters in sort of the work I've done over my career relates to a landslide that occurred in Italy in 1963. And that may seem like ancient history in some regards, but it has informed almost everything that in one way or another I've been involved in my career, even though I was only 2 years old when this happened. So this was an instability that occurred into the then brand new reservoir that was being impounded behind the Vallon Dam. And this is just northeast of Venice in the Dolomite Mountains. And you can see you see my cursor, Joshua? Yep, perfect. So you can see the dam here in the valley, and this was a one of a kind at the time, a very tall, thin arch dam that was held in place by pressure against the rock in the valley. So the dam itself, as you can see on the right-hand side, survived this very well. There was very limited damage, but this entire mountainside came down in a matter of really seconds and filled the reservoir, which you can see on the right-hand side. So 260 million cubic meters of rock. And that created an overtopping wave of water that was in the new impoundment of 50 million cubic meters of water. And so when that much water is displaced very suddenly, it either goes up valley or over the dam. And in this case, it did both. It went up the other side, up the reservoir, up the back, and over the dam. And as a result, in the valley below, the town of Vallon was located just at the sort of outflow of the valley. And you can see on the left side the town before and then after. And this killed 2,000 people because of when it occurred. It occurred at night. So I'm not going to spend any more time on this, but the reason this is so significant is that in retrospect, we could understand the geological reasons for this landslide. We could understand the water pressure, water infiltration into the slope from rainfall in the autumn periods in Italy into the landslide. And we could understand about how some warnings were ignored and how communication was not given to the community. So many, many lessons learned about this that, as I say, transformed particularly reservoir engineering around the world, but also our understanding of large natural rock slope failures. So when we look at there we go. When we look at the work that we do as engineers and scientists with landslides, there's a big long list here. And obviously in 20 minutes, I can't cover this in any way. But I think the critical thing that we have to be aware of as engineers is the need to engage and communicate effectively with everybody involved in the investigation, or if an event occurs, the immediate aftermath, and then the follow-up, cleanup, and restoration subsequently. And when I did my engineering studies, we really didn't consider communication with the public or communication with anybody. We just sort of were doing our calculations. And so this is something over my career that has become increasingly and extremely important. And I think you're all involved in some way or another in some elements of risk-based work in your center. And so I think that the other part of this is that it supports risk-based decision-making. So just very briefly, I'll go down this list. So one of the critical things is trying to locate potential future landslides so that we can do some investigation, we can evaluate the potential for that landslide, we can evaluate the consequences of that landslide. To do so, we really need to focus in on locations, and then we need to understand the materials and the mechanics involved. So as I said, the Vaillant case was very important because it helped us understand in retrospect about that landslide and helps us then to focus in on the investigations we need to do to understand potential behavior in future landslides. We very often then calibrate numerical computer models to simulate observed behavior. In retrospect, we really have a better idea of what might happen, but forecasting is quite challenging because there's a lot of natural variability in materials, a lot of natural variability in the way the landslides behave. Nevertheless, we try and use these models that are calibrated to the observed behavior to forecast potential for failure in the future. So looking at that probability or potential for failure as part of the risk equation. We then develop response scenarios and design engineered solutions. And oftentimes there are possible alternatives. And I think that one of the biggest challenges as engineers we have is to understand the potential, understand what we might do about it, but then find the right solution. If we spend all the money that we should do or could do, we would run out of money very quickly. So oftentimes in engineering, it's and any response, independent of engineering, political responses, anybody's response, it's about where do you spend the money most effectively, because you can't solve all of the problems. Then evaluating the technical and financial viability of managing the landslide, and then implementing the accepted solution. And throughout all of this is the communication component that I mentioned before. So very briefly, because I know some of you know something about slopes and others may not, this is a fairly simplistic diagram showing different ways that slopes can fail. And I'm not going to get into the details, but generally speaking, each of these situations is slightly different geologically, slightly different in terms of the morphology of the terrain. But most importantly, from the perspective of management, is the rate of movement. So on the left side, these are materials that move relatively slowly, and we can manage by moving the road or readjusting power lines, etc. On the right-hand side, when one of these rockfall events occurs, it happens very rapidly with no opportunity to respond during the event. You need to respond before the event. And in between, we have different types of instability. And I think later Alex is going to be talking about debris flows to some extent, which you see in this third diagram. There we go. So just a brief moment of foray into geology. These are all rock slopes, and you can probably see that in each of these cases, the structure that's inherent to the rock controls the way the instability is occurring and the magnitude of instability and the rate of movement. So what we're often looking for is some evidence as to where the instability originates, the rate that it might occur at, and then what we can do about it. So I have 3 videos here showing you 3 quite different instabilities that have occurred in the last decade or so. But when I'm looking at these types of videos, I'm always thinking about these questions you see on the right. So sort of in the engineering mindset, and the geologists as well often are thinking these things as well. What's the reason for the failure? What's the geological reason for the failure? And then what is the anthropogenic or human influence reason for the failure? What's the climatic conditions that lead to the failure? And you'll see in all 3 of these that these occurred at times when there was a lot of extra water in the system. Is there potential for warning on these systems? Is there something we could have done to understand that they might happen and to provide warning so that either construction is not done in the way or we can close the infrastructure to prevent any impact? The rate of the failure, the extent of influence, and then the potential to mitigate. So if I run this first one, this occurred in Tennessee. And if you look over here on the video, you'll see in a moment a little tiny key block fell out, and now the whole slide occurs. There was a previous instability which caused them to temporarily close the road, but the reason this actually occurred is you can see on the left side, they've cut through and undercut those layers, which led to that instability. This next one is, sorry, that's a bit loud. This is located in Switzerland. This is the Illgraben catchment. So this is a mountain slope above, which generates lots of material. And these debris flows occur on a very regular basis. They're in a channelized zone where they've sort of figured out over the years that this material will come down the mountain. It's very well instrumented and understood, and they even have some mitigation. That concrete wall you saw is intended to take some of the energy out of that. So in this case, they understood this over time. They understood that the information in the terrain about where previous debris flows were occurring, and they're able to monitor and pass this material through usually relatively benignly. The final one here is from Norway a couple of summers ago. This is in a location where there are previously marine clays called sensitive clays. And in this case, this whole area is sliding on a very shallow slope on these remobilized, these clays basically become like water at the base. And you can see how this material and the houses and farms on top are flowing out into the fjord. And so this is a location where Norway understands sensitive clays very well, but there's a lot of historic instability or a lot of historic construction on those clays. So what can we do about these things? Can we understand them? Can we warn on them? And then I think probably one of the most important things that I think about when I'm thinking about how we can respond is certainly the volume and where it will go. But most importantly, from the perspective of managing hazard, is how rapid will that instability be? So if you look at this table, this shows you different classes of velocity of these types of events. And you can see extremely slow where, as I said in the first diagram, really limited to maintenance levels of human response required to the movements. And then when you get up into the extremely rapid where things are moving at meters per second or even meters per minute, there really is no response possible when the event is occurring. So you have to anticipate those in advance and have plans in place in advance if you're in that sort of upper velocity realm. And then if we look at the possible impact or probable impact, down in this yellow zone, we've got those very slow moving materials limited to some damage to infrastructure, no loss of life. We get into the velocities where you can warn with evacuation. And in those circumstances, if the warning is given and acted upon, there may be damage to the infrastructure, but there should be no loss of life if the warning is given and people respond. And then these upper velocity categories, if people are in the way, unfortunately, there's no way to get out of the way with those kinds of rates. And so there are some to many lives lost and substantial to catastrophic damage to infrastructure. So in all of this, the remote sensing work we do, the monitoring work we do is around understanding these velocities and what we might be able to do. Again, I think this is a fairly simplistic diagram around risk, thinking about the hazard of that instability and the consequence of that instability. And many of you have probably seen some version of this over the years, but basically anything down in this low category is relatively benign. But when you get up into these very high hazards and consequences, these are the times when we absolutely must do something if we can. And then the yellows and oranges are the categories where we must do something, but maybe there's a bit more time available to respond to them. So in terms of landslides, if we're trying to reduce the consequence, we can do things like land use planning. We can remove or move infrastructure. We can put barricades in the way of the event, especially in the rockfall circumstances. We can put barricades up or channelize, as you saw in the case of that Ilgraben instability. We might bridge or tunnel, and certainly providing warning if there's time for people to evacuate. Critical here is understanding of the expected rate and volume. Then if we're trying to reduce the hazard and move it down, we can do things like drain the slope, support the slope, excavate material from the top of the slope to reduce the weight, for example. But in these cases, there's questions of how feasible is this? Is it technically feasible? If we spend the money doing this, how effective will it be? And even once we've done this, what is the still residual or carry-on consequence of failure? So these are the considerations we have to make when we're looking at this mitigation realm. So very briefly, just to show you some of the mitigation methods, especially for large landslides, water is very often the driver, as I said at the beginning. And so removing water before it even gets into the slopes is a critical thing that we can do. And you can see a variety of situations here where they're either trying to prevent infiltration in the first case in the left-hand diagram, or draining, putting in holes and draining water out of the landslide in the right-hand case. And this is an example of a very large potential landslide in British Columbia and Canada above a major dam, the Mica Dam. And you can see on the left-hand side, this is sort of the outline of this potential large landslide. You can see a bunch of clearings and roads on the landslide surface where they've put in instruments to understand the movement of this landslide. And they've got tunnels underneath from which many kilometers of 1,200 meters, so 12 kilometers of drain holes are drilled up into this landslide from these tunnels to drain water out of it. And in doing so, they've dropped the water pressure in this landslide by up to 120 meters. So that's reducing the pressure, taking the pressure off this landslide and slowing it down. You can also, on a relatively sort of smaller slope scale, drill holes in and put in mechanical supports. So in this case, they're drilling in steel bolts that tie the rock mass together, and they're putting in surface support here, which is steel mesh and then sprayed concrete, for example. So these are some of the ways you can mechanically stabilize the slope. And then this is a case where they're removing material. So this is actually at a diamond mine, but here you can see someone on the slope removing material that otherwise threatens the safety of the people on the road below. And they do this on all sorts of infrastructure, including, in this case, this is a location where there is a road being built at the base here, and is sometimes done with explosives, sometimes with pry bars, sometimes with large excavating equipment. So it's just getting some of the material off the top of the slope. So I'm going to run into a case history in Norway here, which I think explains the broader picture of this kind of engineering and scientific thinking and management. So this is the location of the potential Åknes slide in Norway. It's up in the fjords up here, as you can see on this map of Norway. And this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of the natural beauty of this terrain. You can see in these pictures some of the terrain along these fjords. And this potential landslide here was first identified in the 1950s when people walking on hiking trails were stepping over cracks that were forming at the top of this rock mass. The challenge here is that if this rock slide occurs and lands into the fjord, it will create landslide-induced tsunamic waves, so large waves of water. And when they did surveys of the fjord floor with bathymetry, they noticed very large blocks from previous large instability. So there's one example here just up fjord from Åknes, where they estimate it's about 400 million cubic meters. And they know that this area was glaciated up till about 10,000 years ago. So they know that all evidence they see in the fjord floors is something that's occurred in the last 10,000 years since the end of glaciation. So they can kind of get an idea of how often and how large these instabilities are. If this Åknes landslide occurs, they've calibrated models to look at the wave run-up. So here's a still from one of them. This is a video showing from about 4 minutes from the time of landslide to one of the communities in this area. Because of the terrain, the communities are all on these flat floors that you can see that's completely inundated by water in this simulation. So it's inundated in water from 4 minutes to more than 6-7 minutes beyond the event that might occur. And then when you map this out, you can see here's the Åknes landslide potential here, it's number 14, and you can see the wave run-up height in a matter of minutes up to about 50 meters because these fjord walls are so steep and there's limited capacity for this water to go anywhere other than rise up in these fjord locations. To continue thinking about this, because it's a significant challenge, they did physical testing. So they have a lab where it's about a football field size. And they built a scale model of the fjord floor and the fjord walls. And what you see in these pictures is some stills from this. You can see that they're simulating the rock slide with these large rubber chunks here that they drop into the pool of water. They have systems to measure the run-up of water. You can see here, these are measuring that. They have houses, little model houses on the fjord wall to see how they will respond. And another significant thing from a management perspective is they've actually built in the terminal moraines, different terminal moraines that were deposited as the glaciers were retreating out. So that it leaves a pile of material at the toe of when the glaciers retreating out of the valley. And because these are a rise in elevation in the floor of the fjord, they wonder whether this might help mitigate some of the run-up. Certainly in some of the events of ocean tsunamic waves, like in the Indian Ocean tsunami, which caused so much loss of life, in locations where there were reefs, they noticed that those help mitigate some of those waves. And they're wondering whether, in this case, some of these terminal moraines just below the surface of the water might also help mitigate the waves. So here's a video from German television, but if anybody understands German, you may get something out of this. But basically there they are dropping a half volume, so 50 million cubic meters. And you can see the water coming. That's the town of Helleselt that I just showed you. And it's showing you the influence on the community. So we've got physical modeling and we've got computer modeling of this event. So in this case, they hypothesized a geological model from walking over the terrain, from understanding the sort of geology in the subsurface, and they could look at how this instability would occur.
I'm not cutting you off, Jean, sorry, just your 20-minute warning. I was just letting you know.
Thanks, Joshua. Thanks. So they investigated this instability because of the significant influence. Because it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, there are a lot of visitors and ships. There are people who live along the fjord. So if this landslide were to occur, there would be a catastrophic outcome in terms of the speed and size of the wave. So they used a helicopter to take a number of instruments up onto the slope. They drilled holes into the slope, trying to understand the depth, the size, the volume, and the rate of movement of this instability. They provided information to the public about what they were putting up on the slope in terms of monitoring. There's a lot of detail on this, but just moving in here, there's a whole series of different instruments that tell you something about how the slope is moving, both on surface and subsurface. There are equipment derived from geophysics systems where it tells you something about whether the rock is cracking or not. It's listening for whether the rock is cracking. There's rainfall records. There's a radar system that monitors the slope. So a lot of different tools intended to understand what's happening here. They took there's a whole bunch of really cool results from this. I'm just going to show you two. In the borehole, they took a camera down and they could see here, you can see this is the sliding surface of that landslide. So you can see that is more than 1.5 centimeters of open space in that hole, and that is the location which is sliding on. And you can see that if there's water in that slope, that's where it will concentrate, and that's where it will help to basically lubricate this landslide. They could also see from a radar system that was parked across the fjord from the slope, where it's moving, how rapidly it's moving, when it's moving, and they can correlate that to the weather conditions and the rainfall conditions. So when we know something about the rate of movement, we can get an idea of what might be happening. So there's a very famous person in our field called Ralph Peck, and he wrote a lot of really interesting and important things in the 60s. And he said that observations must be reliable, they must reveal the significant phenomena, and they must be reported so as to encourage prompt action. So in the case of Auchness, they have velocity levels that you can see here, anywhere from green to red. And at the beginning, they really didn't know whether they should be focusing on centimeters per day of movement or millimeters per day, whether they should be looking at how fast it was accelerating, so is it changing in rate, or whether it was how much movement had occurred altogether. Because you can imagine that as rock slopes move, there's continual damage on those sliding surfaces, and at some point that becomes more and more smooth and can lead to an instability. So working this out from that monitoring information was extremely important. And what it did do was give them reasons or methods to both evaluate the information. So you can see across the bottom here how often it was being looked at, what kind of team was involved. And as we go to the right, we get the police being informed because they will evacuate the area if this occurs, and they get more and more people involved on a more regular basis looking at the data. And most importantly, from the perspective of public safety, as you get up into these orange levels and red levels, in the orange level, they evacuate anybody who would take more time to move. So they evacuate schools, old age homes, hotels, etc., and they put others on standby for evacuation. And then when you get up into this red level, the evacuation is managed by the police. So that's how you use this information to try and move people out of the way if this is about to happen. They test the emergency plans. They hold now yearly trials to look at how to respond to this, how to evacuate. And they have a web page which shows something about the level of potential instability. You can see that on the left here. It's like if you're used to the sort of fire warning sign, similar idea. At the point when I took the screen grab, it was in a low potential for instability. So I just got a couple more here, Joshua, and then I won't do the last part of this. I was too ambitious. So I mentioned before that we calibrate simulations, and in this case, this is a PhD student who worked on calibrating a simulation of this landslide. This is like a cross section down through the landslide, with the fjord being down at the bottom right, and in it they simulate the water level. That's the blue line here, and they simulate locations where there's enhanced deformation. And what they discovered was that if there is a seismic event or an earthquake and the pore pressure is elevated to a relatively normal high level, this could occur. And it could occur also if you have unusually high levels of water infiltration into the slope. So they realized they had to do something about this. And so now they're looking at putting in tunnels like the one I showed you earlier, where they can put in a tunnel, put in a bunch of drain holes and pull this water pressure down below the sliding surface. So the objective is to get the water below the sliding surface so it's no longer leading to this potential. And to do so, they would put a wall up on the mountainside to keep water from flowing from the mountain into the top crack of the landslide, which you can see here. And they have two plans, one either to come from this valley with a very long tunnel or to come from the fjord, sort of the contact between the fjord and the rock wall and drill a spiral tunnel in. The objective of both of these potentials is to put these drain holes up into the landslide. And at the time of this publication, it was about a 50 million, I think it was US dollar price tag to do this. The other thing that I think the last thing I want to say is that this then led to changes in public policy and changes in regulation. So in the Norwegian Building Code, they now have all of the information you see here about warnings, but also more importantly, from a safety perspective, the timing on warnings. So warning time shall be not shorter than 72 hours to give people time to think about it. And the evacuation time should be maximum 12 hours. So this is the kind of false warning situation where many times you might be moving towards what you think is instability, and to be safe, you move people out, but you need to bring them back in within 12 hours under this building code. And you need to have monitoring. So, and you need to have sufficient technical people to understand this. So I'm just going to zoom through these last little bits here and come to my last slide, which is thank you very much for your attention. And I'll turn it back to you, Joshua. Thank you.
No, thank you, Jean. Thank you so very, very, very much. I'm looking forward to a little bit of discussion on what you've just presented. But for now, let's go over to Alex. And importantly for everyone on the call, Alex and Jean have both said that they're around for 10 to 15 minutes after the top of the hour. So if Alex's presentation takes us all the way up to 4 o'clock UK time, there will still be the opportunity for you to ask some questions.
Okay, Joshua, just checking that you're hearing me still. Yes, perfect. Okay, so passing the baton to myself from Jean. So where do we go in this intermediary area? There's the academic world where we analyze the forensics after an event, and there's the implementation of monitoring programs, as we just saw on that site from Norway, as to how do you warn beforehand that something is happening. But what I'm going to cover is that middle ground. What happens if the event occurs anyways, and what is an engineering perspective on the actual response in practice? So I'm going to show you some videos and some photos of what a site looks like in a disaster. These aren't the large disasters. I've been out to some of the larger ones. The team I'm on responds to things such as the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, but that's not the norm. The norm is actually responding to smaller disasters. And so I'm going to walk through a little bit of that today. So as Joshua introduced me to, or introduced me with, I am on a team called the Canada Task Force 1 team. We're a federal government asset. We're not a volunteer team, we're a professional team. So we're on call and we get called up to say there's been a disaster domestically or internationally, and the government is wanting to send the team into action. We get called in when local resources are basically overwhelmed or paralyzed by not knowing what to do. I am based in Vancouver, and that's in the province of British Columbia. And so by the fact that the team is based in the locations, the team also has to service these municipalities and regions first. But we are an asset for the federal government. So what does this sort of team look like? And I think there was a talk about 6 months ago from a member of a similar search and rescue team from the UK, which is one of the volunteer ones. We're a little different. As I mentioned, we're a federal team. We're a professional organization group. And so we're considered a heavy task force team, or in the US parlance, a tier 1 team. They like to have their own names for things. So what does that mean? We are able to provide 24/7 operations, so we can work day and night. We are fully self-sufficient for at least 10 days. So we don't need any external requirements of support. We don't need vehicles. We don't need water, medical food. We bring all that with us, whether that means loading it onto a heavy military plane and bringing vehicles with us, all of the medical equipment, everything like that. We're 120 people on this team that can divide up into 2 teams of 60, 4 teams of 30, 8 teams of 15. It's made so that we deploy like a military group. But we're not, we're paramilitary. So we have firefighters and police with K9. We have paramedics and emergency room physicians and professional engineers, which is I'm one of the professional engineers on the team. And you can see a list there of all the different sort of things that the team can do in terms of rescue and logistics. Provide incident management. We can set up temporary government decisions to provide support in the immediacy of a disaster when many of the groups, smaller communities, they just don't have the background. They've never been through some of these events before, and they don't know what to do. So we can step in to guide a mayor or a council on how to make decisions and what should be done first. So we're there within hours of an event. We're there as the first responders, essentially. So Joshua mentioned I do have a day job. That's me on the left there, and on a site out in Chile in the Andes. And on the right is me when it's the non-day job. This is actually our training, wearing a swift water rescue suit. But getting into the actual meat of the topic, the discussion of what happens in these sorts of events. Atmospheric rivers, these intense bands of rain, are what drive a lot of disasters around the world. They do, especially in North America. When you look at our planet, our nice marble, it has these white bands on it. And those white bands are clouds, and they're very narrow in some cases. And so when these bands move around, they can funnel a huge amount of precipitation over a limited period of time over single locations. And so many of the events that happen that I have to respond to are as a result of these atmospheric rivers striking land and depositing hundreds of millimeters of rain in a short period of time. So the first example we've got is one back in 2021. This is some satellite imagery, and you'll see this large white plume that starts to sweep across to Vancouver, where I'm based. And it sits on this area essentially for about 3 days, dropping a lot of precipitation, hundreds of millimeters of precipitation. Tied with the fact that that had to go over some mountains, and as you rise over the mountains, you drop even more precipitation, we ended up with a large flood occurring. The flood ended up being a 500-year event in some locations. So very, very extreme. That led to landslides, it led to flooding, it led to all sorts of disasters on a regional basis, cutting off actually a section of the country from the rest. So we couldn't. All the rail was out. All the bridges were out for the highways were washed away. Communications were disrupted. It was a very significant event in Canadian history. So here's kind of what it looked like. You can see some of the bridges in the top left corner being knocked out, some of the flooding, the military deployment, the railway bridge on the left at the bottom being undermined, so not able to take any loads. We had highways with washouts on the top left where pipelines are being exposed, so having to turn off the oil and gas supply to the region. All sorts of chaos essentially going on. So, Joshua, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear the sound on this one?
One of the most dramatic scenes played out today on Highway 7. That's along the northern bank of the Fraser River between Hope and Agassiz. 2 landslides stranded nearly 300 people overnight. Susanna De Silva is near the slides, and Susie, rescuers spent all day trying to get them out. Where do things stand tonight?
Well, Ian, some of the dramatic aerial rescue efforts of the day have now stopped. Of course, it is dark, but they worked right until that last little sliver of daylight to work to get through people out. They were able to bring about 300 people to this reception center here where they are processed. Some of them are staying. Some of them were able to go home or find friends and family to come and pick them up. But we are told there are still more people stranded on that highway on the other side of one of the slides. They're hoping to clear another slide to get those people out and get them towards Hope. But for tonight, those efforts continue, and about 60 people now are hunkering down for the night here at this reception center after a very difficult day.
I didn't know what we were going to go through. To be honest, I thought more rocks were going to fall off.
The trip home from a relaxing winter vacation soon turned into a harrowing nightmare for Corey Lizo-Herka and his family. First, forced to turn off one highway, being overtaken by rushing water, only to get trapped on another between 2 slides.
I thought the more the hill was going to fall, and you could see the waterfalls coming, and I thought, is this kind of it? Like, it sounds cliche, but I really thought, is this the day I'm done? Yeah, it was.
It was pitch black, and they were out of options.
There was really nowhere you could go, and even if you did go somewhere, like what it says just down 100 meters down the road, that area's not going to collapse on you too.
They were among around 275 people forced to spend the night in their vehicles as rescuers focused on about a dozen people trapped in the torrent of debris.
They were still very liquid, moving, and full of huge chunks of debris like trees and rocks.
I think there was like 3 or 4 cars that had gotten pulled in, and there were people yelling for help last night, and it was really hard to sleep because car alarms were going off that got sucked into the river, and I was just super worried about the people that were getting rescued down there.
Officials don't yet know if there are other vehicles trapped in the debris. Crews battled brutal weather conditions, sending a steady stream of helicopters in to bring people out 20 at a time in order of need.
So I received a call. It was late at night, being picked up in an emergency vehicle. And so it's the video I took on the bottom left there showing driving along with the lights and sirens and heading out to an area where we're told there are being cars swept off the road into the river. Some are on fire. Some people are missing. People are stranded and trapped. And the decision comes back to me as the engineer on this to decide, how are we going to approach rescue? What can we do? Where are we going to put people? And how are we going to get them out? So it being dark, we didn't have the ability to fly helicopters at night in the low cloud and the mountainous terrain out here. So we had to just start with rescue of the people who are trapped in their vehicles and in the river, searching. And my responsibility, once that was undertaken and being worked on, was to then figure out, where do we put all the other people? You heard in that news report, the person said they didn't know where they could go, where was going to be safe. My job was to assess, where could we stick 300 cars worth of people that were going to be there for, could be a couple of days, while I had to bring in helicopters. I called the military and said we needed them to bring their large helicopters in, and we'll clear a landing space for them. And they were going to then have to shuttle people out, abandon the vehicles, and we would proceed that way. So what did I do? I looked for, where was the bedrock exposed in the highway cuts? Where did we see thick soils? And decided that the rock cuts at that point were going to be the most stable. I had limited information and collected all the people in their cars and had put them into a small area. People had to share other vehicles. We had to kind of go. This is 2021. COVID is still a concern. but the chance of catching COVID and dying from it was going to be a lot less than the chance of being killed by a further debris slide or rockfall coming off there. So this is what the second day when I was able to get a drone up. And so you can see the large amount of massive material that's come down, and it'll spin around in a second. And very muddy river at this point, because this is after the atmospheric river has just finished coming through and all the flooding and all the debris that's washed into the river. And you can see how it's scoured and removed all the trees and deposited all this material down at the bottom, washing out the highway. And just there in the top left, you'll see some of the vehicles stuck under a bluff that I kind of kept them all at. And this had multiple events like this going down at the same time. So I'll skip forward on that one. So while this event was happening, flooding was still occurring. And so once we finished this deployment, we were immediately tasked to another area to support a city that had to have a partial evacuation. Large amount of water had backed up from rivers, had overflowed their banks, and an ancient lake essentially had reformed in a valley. And so here's an overview satellite image of the area. And one of my tasks at this point was to help with the evaluation of all the homes for the evacuation. So we had to do an assessment of, are they in a safe state to be reoccupied in the future? Are there any people that are trapped and need to be rescued? And kind of coordinating essentially the response associated with that. So I had access to satellite imagery, and so this was on one of the days, and a few of the days later, you can see the rains had stopped, the flooding had started to recede, and this lake is kind of still present, but the area on the bottom left had withdrawn. But one of the techniques I was able to use also was radar. And so one of the remote sensing bands is that if you use radar, it reflects really well off of water. And so it's very easy to identify flooded areas and to do GIS calculations to figure things out. And I could then, over each day's track of the satellites going by, see the gradual reduction in the water and where would we be able to do searches and where would we be able to assess properties. So this is an example, set up a grid, find all the properties. So every single structure in the community had to be assessed. And so we looked at over 3,000 or 4,000 of these ones in a period of a couple of days. So we had our team, we conscripted city planners, building engineers, a bunch of people from the communities, brought them in and gave them forms to fill out. And so essentially, this is kind of what they were looking at. What is the potential for damage and collapse? How much percentage? What needs to be done? Can they occupy it? Is it restricted for use? And make those assessments in all these areas. And then, it wasn't quite accurate. Fire chief for one of the locations said, "Oh, great, I'm this picture of me there on the left-hand side on being posted," and say, "Oh, I have communication with NASA." It wasn't NASA. I was actually communicating with the Canadian Space Agency and getting their satellite imagery, and then passing that to the military. And so I was directing where the military would go to either perform rescue or to actually help escort the building staff to go and do the assessments at all the different structures. I indicated or mentioned the concept of getting the satellite imagery. One thing that as a disaster professional you should be recognizing is that there is an international space charter for disasters. And essentially what it allows is any of the member countries, of which pretty much any of the countries that have satellites up are members of this one, that if a host country declares an emergency, they get access to the imagery that comes from all the satellites that go over top of those countries. And so this is coordinated by essentially almost like the UN. It's not the UN, but it's a similar concept in that you request this and then you can get an end feed. So I didn't actually have to implement this one because we had Canadian satellites going over and it was in Canada. So I was able to just get the Canadian information. But if it was over a foreign country, we would have gone this route. Jumping forward to just 4 or 5 months ago, last October, we had another of these atmospheric rivers. And just by the way, we have an atmospheric river happening in Vancouver today. It's been going for the last 4 days. And so we're a little nervous as to what's going on. But we had a pretty big one come in October. And so we had almost 300 millimeters of rain land in some spots over a 2-day period. And this is what that started to look like. The amount of water that was coming down and gathering. We had cars floating around. We had just horrendous conditions for walking around. I don't know why the person, especially being caught in the news, walking their dog through a stream like that. Just seemed cruel. But it was phenomenal, the amount of material that was coming down. Again, you can see the color, it's not clear water. This is bringing mud along with it, so it's mud coming from somewhere. And so I'll show the news of one we were then called out to another event.
Pure devastation. Belongings of Sonia McIntyre scattered around for hundreds of meters. The property unrecognizable. Her home destroyed. Her life lost.
It's devastating. I mean, it's like somebody died here.
McIntyre's friend and former partner Jim Millington headed over to the Corey Road residence after watching the news Monday morning.
And it was a single lady living in a house, and I just had a feeling, that sick feeling that, you know, it might have been her.
Sadly, he was right. After a search that began early afternoon Saturday, Coquitlam Fire and Rescue, assisted by Canada's Heavy Urban Search and Rescue Team, found the 57-year-old dead, nearly 300 meters from where her home sat.
So unlike the one that was out in Agassiz, where we showed up at night in extremely poor conditions, this was still raining, but it was daylight. And that daylight allowed us to do operations slightly differently. I had a little bit of time while I was on my way to the site to start pulling in some LiDAR. And so what you'll see here is some of the imagery that I had available at the time, and I was able to look at where are we going to, what does the topography look like. And LiDAR is actually really, really beneficial in making decisions on the fly. If you are going to become a professional working in the disaster response, being able to interpret aerial imagery, satellite imagery, LiDAR, allows you to understand the scale that you're going to have to be dealing with and where things might come and go to. And so this yellow line is where the path of the debris came down. It's not the gully beside it, which is where people would have expected. And so because it had actually no major gully above, it has a limited source of material to come back down. And so knowing that from the years of experience that I've had, I was able to tell the team that they could start their search and we could even continue it into the night. So they were out there looking through, and this is what it looked like. You know, I took this video here within the minutes of arriving. So it's still raining, water's come down. It has removed all of the soil, or most of the soil, off of this slope here, and it's then come through. And clear water now, so not a lot of muddiness to it, but you can see bits of foundation, and you'll see here in a second the wall, and essentially that's all that's left of a house. It's gone. And now we have to search for the victim. Maybe they're alive, not likely, maybe, but we have to search for them, and if not, we're trying to do a recovery and find their body. So part of my role then is to say, where should we look? You know, the initial thing is people start looking around the side of the house. But from my experience, I was able to suggest to them that no, this is going to have transported, because you can see there's not much of a house left, and all the wood at the end of the image there, all of this would have transported several hundred meters down. And I was able to say to the teams, here's a 50-meter wide path, about 200 meters long, that you should probably focus your search in, because this is how a debris flow actually moves. So here's some of my drone imagery. You can see the foundation of the house there. Here's the path the debris flow took along. And it gets wider and wider. And as we cross over a road here, we continue to see the materials move past into the forest below. And this is the search area. And so I was suggesting this focus in this area where the creek is flowing currently, this narrow spot about 50 meters wide. And in fact, that is where we located the victim about a day later. Going to jump forward to another one, the Lions Bay landslide that occurred, or debris flow that occurred about a month and a half ago. It was just before Christmas.
A path of destruction leaves one person dead and another missing after a landslide in Lions Bay.
Immediately was the mud. I was so surprised on both sides, north and south, how far it had stretched. And then just the power of, you know, a part of the mountain falling down was pretty surreal.
A local state of emergency has been declared as the search continues for a missing person.
It's like, oh my God. And I just, right as I drove through it, I had that kind of feeling of being within a natural disaster and just kind of in awe of what happened around that area.
Crews can be seen standing where a house was swept away from on Glendale Avenue. 2 people were believed to be living at the house.
So again, what is the decisions that need to be made by an engineer in the heat of the moment? It's basically, is it safe to start rescue? And so I was able to get up in a helicopter quickly and start to look at where did the material come from again? What's it looking like? You can see it's crossed over the highway there. It's very brown, muddy water, but where has this material originated from? And is it likely to happen again? If it is, we're not going to be able to put rescuers into that site. It's too dangerous to start the rescue. If it isn't, then we need to get going quickly because, again, the weather can turn poor, the night can come, and I have to make that assessment on, is it safe to continue doing operations when you can't see in front of you? So those are those sorts of decisions there. So yeah, the helicopter showed that there was no new source potential. So that was a good thing. The site was on the elevated part of a channel bank where the house was hit, and so that was also a good thing. I couldn't see all the way up the channel by standing on the ground. All I could see up was a few hundred meters. I didn't have a clear line of sight all the way back to the source. So if something did occur secondary, with that rates that Gene was talking about of about 5 meters or maybe even 15 meters per second, we would only have 10 or 20 seconds before something struck us and would have to get the team out. So a lot of concern there. So that was a negative. But the weather conditions were not great. It was very rainy and windy at the time, but it was improving. So I think that was an upside. So in that case, I gave a decision of yes, we could start the rescue recovery operations, the search operations. They could start to try and figure out how to clear and open the highway as well down below. And I was also comfortable for night operations to occur. Let's get past that little video. So again, having LiDAR is very, very helpful. So this red star is the site where the debris flow struck the house. And you would expect, again, that you would have thought it would have been along the main gully that's over there on the right, but in fact, it wasn't. So looking at the LiDAR gave me a sense of where things would be. Flying our drone, I was able to make an ortho photo, snap a few hundred photos, stitch them all together, and you can get a very high resolution image that allows you to see that path and to be able to say with reasonable certainty that there's limited source areas above, whereas on either side of this area, this community has been hit with debris flows and fatal ones, in fact, before. There are plentiful sources of material that could come down, but nothing looking like another event might happen in the area that we were going to be working. So again, developing a search, coordinating with the team. I'm out there on the site and making sure that as we play with the ground, this pickup sticks situation that we've got, that we aren't going to start shifting the material around that might impact our team safety or that of a potential live victim that we're trying to find. It's often quite a harrowing experience standing out there in these areas where you have all that uncertainty. So again, this is kind of what it looked like. There was a 2-story house here. It had been destroyed by large timbers pushing through and shoving its, the remnants of the house further down the hill where we had to send our team into. Using chainsaws and manual equipment to try and move things around. Eventually, we had to, over the next several days, bring in heavy equipment. But in the immediacy of the search, bring in our search dogs, using the cameras and things like that. One of the latest tools that we've got that's actually really, really helpful is the drone. And the drone we've got is able to fly in rain and in cold weather. It has thermal and it has night vision to it. So here's what the thermal imagery looks like, and there's the night vision. And this is from several hundred meters up. Like this is a ways way up, and where the zoom we're able to still see with very good quality with the night vision what's going on. I'm standing up there behind the light, not just at the top of the picture there in this shot. Kind of looking down in the hole, directing people as they start to move pieces to make sure we don't disturb this entire pile and have it crumble and shift in such a way that we either trap some of our workers or potentially risk the victim. And again, here is the side-by-side imagery of the exact same. And you can see the quality of the night vision that you can get from several hundred meters up compared to the thermal. The thermal is useful, though, for finding people who might be trapped, especially if they are in an area where they're close enough to surface for that heat to emanate up, and then can help us target where do we need to go to search. Last thing I want to show is the ability, if you take enough of the drone photos, you can actually stitch it all together and make a photorealistic view of the site. And so this is where I've taken about 400 photos from the drone, stitched it all together, and allows you to get a much better understanding of what has happened. We use this for explanation for mayors and councils and government bodies. We use this, if I can produce it quickly in a rough version, for planning where we need to go and what we need to watch for, where should I station people for safety, if we have multiple events to look at. And then, of course, this is great for passing back to academia afterwards to start doing some forensics. What was the condition? What are the angles? What does it actually look like out there? And it can get kind of fun in terms of making yourself a bit of a Steven Spielberg movie, and you can dive right into the slide, as you'll see right here. You can see they were quite lucky. This couple of houses beside, they got some minor damage, but they weren't destroyed. And same way as right there on the left where the house was. And then the highway, which has been cleared at the time that these photos were all taken, went over the edge and down towards a railway and some houses down below. And we had to evacuate all of these individuals, and some of them remain on evacuation right now. And we're still doing the forensics for what are the potentials for further slides to happen, especially given I said we're having a atmospheric river right now. So there's some contact details if anybody ever wants to reach out. This is recorded, so you can pause this slide if you ever want to get my details. And I'll pass it back to you, Joshua.
Thank you so very much, Alex. And again, a big thank you to both of you, to Jean, to you, Alex, for your time and for such interesting presentations. I've certainly learned a lot from today. I have